United States is rightly in a cold sweat about controlling its territory and sovereignty and about its disastrous pre-9/11 immigration and visa lapses. So consider in that context the fact that the Canadian numbers I've referred to in per capita terms amount to double the American immigrant numbers. And I haven't mentioned the refugee intake, asylum seekers in the US terminology. Our refugee numbers have skyrocketed from 500 people in 1977 to about 30,000 a year today. And that's roughly a 6,000% increase, of course, and per capita triple or quadruple the United States refugee figures. Well, as satisfactory as all this might be to the drivers of the system, the immigration lawyers, the often government-funded NGOs, settlement organizations, employers trying to drive down wages and so on, it has opened dangerous possibilities for newcomers and the rest of us alike. Canadians have been told that we need more people, immigrants, to support our old age, Canada's aging population. But our system is actually said to admit proportionally more senior citizens than already exist in our population. As Diane Francis said in her book, Immigration, the Economic Case, and I quote, "As policies now stand, the average immigration age will continue to rise because immigration officials are approving the entry of enough parents and grandparents as sponsored immigrants to replace a small town every year." Now remember that this is a small town in a country with about 1/10 the population of the United States. Bear in mind, too, the Federal Department of Health, Health Canada's assessment that senior citizens on average use more than 3 times the medical services of younger citizens. No small item if you are dealing with a country that relies upon socialized Medicare. And be aware that economically unproductive persons naturally draw the same amount of energy, heat in Canada, of course, air conditioning and the rest, as more productive citizens. Indeed, one might ask why the proportion of family class newcomers, including the aged, has been increasing when no education, skills, or language requirements attached to this category. As for the refugee explosion, serious liberal-minded specialists who do not rely on immigration and refugee streams for their own incomes, people like former Canadian Ambassador Martin Collicott, have testified that we in Canada are alone among nations in the absurdly open definition of Geneva Convention refugees that we use. One statistic from the United Nations Commissioner for Refugees is quite interesting. It's altogether in 2003, it said, Canada granted refugee status to more than twice as many Pakistanis as did all other countries in the world combined. In fact, our refugee acceptance rates are about 50%, whereas a basket of 17 Western countries have their refugee acceptance rates at about 12%. And no one need be reminded of the Canadian Auditor General's concern about the 45,000 people, now thought to be closer to 52,000, mainly failed refugee claimants who were ordered deported and simply disappeared, possibly running loose within Canada today. Examining the leadership level, many conclude that the only explanation for this system is that it is, and has long been, a vote-importing racket upon which a generation of politicians have relied for re-election by grateful newcomers, their family sponsors, and those hoping one day to become sponsors. One Liberal Party leadership candidate is even today talking about doubling our intake and perhaps his vote. Another wants to add a modest 100,000 people per year, largely family class. Well, what's the counter-terror relevance of all of this? First of all, I cannot see how Canada can credibly screen this many newcomers, 1 million people every 4 years and 60% landing in Toronto alone. We only have at most a few thousand security officers doing the screening. And what, for example, do assurances about screening mean when someone comes from, say, Iran, creator of Islamic extremism's bloodthirsty, West-hating monster Hezbollah? Recent history says an Iranian official was able to beat to death, possibly after raping, Canadian photographer Mrs. Zahra Khasemi, without even being charged. Indeed, the only consequence to the assailant is a place on the Iranian delegation to what passes for the United Nations Human Rights Council. So how meaningful is it when Western security or immigration services conclude that a prospective, say, Iranian immigrant or refugee is of no concern because that person's country of origin reports no criminal record back home? Well, this background reveals a little of what is turning Canada into a terrorist haven. Why the Canadian Security Intelligence Service says we have about 50 terrorist organizations on our soil, and why we, therefore, are, in terms of this number, the second most penetrated country by terrorists in the world after the United States itself. This kind of situation makes less of a mystery of Montreal-based Ahmed Ressam, the millennial bomber. You'll remember that but for an American border officer intercepting him in 1999 en route to trying to blow up the LA International Airport, he would have brought 9/11 early. Now, to be sure, none of the actual 9/11 attackers came through Canada. But if Ressam had succeeded, responsibility for his early version of 9/11 would have been on Canada's doorstep. Ressam was himself associated with Le Groupe Fatah Kamel, an Islamist bunch of New Canadians with a serious Montreal presence. This gang was convicted in France and led France's leading counter-terror magistrate to refer to Canada in the same breath as Algeria, Bosnia, and similar places. And then there's the first family of terror, certain members of the Toronto area Khadr family, led by their mercifully deceased patriarch. He was apparently killed in a shootout with Pakistani police. And did I mention that Mr. Kamel and most of the Khadrs are now back in Canada, one of the suspect Khadr family members enjoying the benefits of socialized Medicare to look after apparent war wounds. But there's far more to the problem of sheer numbers of newcomers than meets the eye. What happens as now when communities that include radical, illiberal, supremacist people arrive in Canada? Well, simple. They'll do what we now see happening in Canada. They will revel in the economic support systems of a socialized welfare state while isolating themselves psychologically and possibly physically as radical communities among the mainstream. They will, in the case of radical Islam, shunt aside co-religionists who would accommodate themselves to our liberal pluralist society and ethos. And of course, from their viewpoint, these supremacists must do no less. For while you and I live the pluralist dream of diversity and mutual respect, radical fundamentalist newcomers will have very different preoccupations. The first of these will be to ensure the continued untouched purity of their colonies from what a wife of one of among a group of recently arrested terrorist suspects in the Toronto area described as this filthy country, a reference endearing as it is to Canada. The concentration, the extremist purity of these psychosocial colonies in our midst can only increase with the vast numbers concerned. It establishes the conditions for the propagating rather than the diluting of radical messages within such communities. And this, in turn, kicks out the props from under such concepts as respectful coexistence and tolerance. For it's only through encouraging interaction with the other that we can have our intolerant edges smoothed out and ensure that civil society remains civil. One assessment of a 2004 Federal Statistics Department report reflects the scale and momentum of the building problem of isolation. The report says that rather than encouraging integration, our policies have, and I quote a source on this, the number of such visible minority neighborhoods increased from 6 in 1981 to 254 in 2001. All of this provides conditions for the grooming of young minds for radical intolerance, surely the premise of terror. In other words, this prepares the Petri dish in which the homegrown threat grows. And that at once introduces the homegrown phenomenon and illustrates its overlapping relation to the foreign terrorist threat. So now, homegrown terrorists. These are generally conceived to be those who are Canadian-born or have spent the bulk of their lives in Canada. They're people who would in saner times ordinarily be expected to see themselves as part of the Canadian landscape rather than as visceral despisers and enemies of Canada and the West. It remains to be seen whether evidence will reveal that the 18 generally young Muslims who were recently charged with terror offenses in Toronto emerge as part of the homegrown pattern. The same will be decided in the case of young Mr. Khawaja, a young Muslim whose trial on unrelated terror matters in Ottawa is slated for January 2007. But it is interesting to note that not so long ago, say 15 or 20 years ago, to talk of homegrown radicals and terrorists in Canada was to speak of the tiny, perennially unhappy band associated with the thinking of the Ku Klux Klan, Euro supremacism, Aryan and Christian supremacist and terrorist movements. Over intervening years, Canadians have dealt such extremists apparently decisive blows. Well, how is this? Essentially, through near universal recognition of their attendant evils, through education and, where appropriate, police action. For better or worse, human rights commissions and entire human rights industries would emerge from public recognition of the problems presented by supremacism. No credible opinion makers want to coax from these haters justifications of the hatred they bear the other. Unfortunately, today, what is sometimes called political correctness has been used to confer a kind of untouchability upon those who propagate doctrines no less grievous than those associated with, for example, white supremacism. World record-breaking immigration numbers mean that political demographics increasingly reflect radical Islamist strains of thought and influence in Canada. Political correctness, along with its cousin, subjective relativism, has interfered with Canadians' ability to see and to come to confidence to grips with the implications of this. So, for example, we now see medieval Islamism gathering its forces in Alberta, and so far, successfully summoning the province's Human Rights Commission to pursue the Western Standard magazine for the sin of publishing cartoons of Muhammad, the notorious ones you will have remembered from some rioting. Reflecting society's desperate effort not to offend self-selected victims, the Commission has flaccidly agreed to allow the process to proceed. This has achieved several things relevant to and symbolic of Islamic radicalization in Canada. First, of course, is costing the magazine money and telegraphing the fact to other Canadian media outlets who will be wary of imagined Islamic sensibilities. The effect is to confer upon those sensibilities a privileged treatment otherwise not expected by moderate Muslims or other religionists of pluralist bent. So in its failure, here is the Human Rights Commission, a government quasi-judicial body in Canada, being used indirectly to enforce Sharia law's ban on representations of Muhammad. And there have been campaigns to install Sharia law in my province of Ontario. Legislation, remember, is not the only way to introduce and enforce Sharia law in Canada. Well, what does this have to do with radicalism and terror? It risks establishing in Islamic newcomers, first generation, and other folk unreasonable expectation that Islam has and should have a privileged legal status not contemplated for other religions or ideologies. It encourages an appetite for more of the same. It does not take in hand those newcomers or early generation Islamic families whose traditions might derive from backgrounds that have excluded liberal pluralism or indeed declared it anathema. And so we get demands for privileged treatment urged on by Wahhabist and Muslim Brotherhood-oriented human rights organizations, perhaps in the form of prayer rooms, in public learning and other institutions that would not otherwise offer these benefits to anyone. And expectations, such as where a tax-paid municipal swimming pool in our nation's capital is used for what amounts to publicly funded de facto women of the veil swimming periods. In the spirit of gender apartheid, men and male lifeguards are excluded from the pool, and an entire floor of an Ottawa community centre is banned to male traffic. In the expectation such situations develop, we see interactive pluralism blocked and no opportunity for the kind of mixing and encouraging of intercultural humility upon which we had lately been thriving in peace and stability. The corollary of this situation and these expectations is that any limits eventually imposed may be portrayed as victimizing of those Muslims who had come to view such arrangements as their entitlement. As moderate Muslims point out, prominent, well-known, Wahhabist-oriented Canadian Arab and Islamic representative groups constantly claim persecution and so-called anti-Muslim incidents everywhere, despite the evidence. Whatever their aims or motives, deeply troubling groups like the Council on American Islamic Relations, CARE, seem to stoke the flames. All of this, combined with efforts of foreign and domestic originating radical Islamic provocateurs, builds alienation to a crescendo. So in recent months, we've seen unembarrassed displays in the streets of Canada by Hezbollah supporters, some even intimidating police in the vicinity. We've seen politicians of our previous federal government holding hands with the wrong kinds of organizations. In a debate in 2002-03 about which organizations to ban under terror law, many were horrified to see our then foreign minister, before his government was thrown out and replaced by the current Harper Conservative Party government, arguing that Hamas and Hezbollah should not be banned. The foreign minister's Liberal Party government had apparently calculated that immigration-born demographic shifts had brought enough radical Islamist voters to make this pro-terror gamble worth their while. Ultimately, a popular outcry forced the government to ban these, but in one case it took the threat of a lawsuit to achieve this. That same government refused to ban the granddaddy of suicide bombing organizations, the Tamil Tigers. Conventional wisdom is that the Liberal Party was vying for the tens of thousands of radical ethnic Tamil votes available in important Toronto electoral districts. The new Conservative government seems to be trying to deal more realistically with the threat and has banned the Tigers. It is, however, unclear whether even the new leadership will have the courage to master the immigration situation underlying some of Canada's more self-destructive terror dynamics. So in sum, immigration can be invaluable, but in Canada it is proving to be something of a double-edged sword. Thank you for that.
I was told to talk something about the practical aspects of immigration, and that gives me a broad enough topic to dive in. And basically, if we want to approach immigration in a practical way, we would enact and champion the enactment of a comprehensive immigration reform. And unfortunately, up to now, we have seen our Congress, the House, only happy to give us a piecemeal enforcement proposed legislation, which I hope President Bush ultimately vetoes and forces both the House and the Senate to return to a serious comprehensive reform. Now, it's perhaps good to begin by pointing out that today we are observing Columbus Day, and when Columbus arrived to these shores, he did not arrive with a visa. However, the immigration issue is not to be viewed purely as a border issue. It's not fundamentally about borders or border security. Immigration is, at this present time, a labor issue. And this is a labor issue that is played out throughout the world. It's an international challenge that many countries face. Even today, on the border between China and Russia, the border towns on the Russian side of the border are filled with Chinese workers who have crossed over without papers, without legal documentation, to work in the trade and that part of the eastern, very far eastern Russia. We see the same thing in Brazil and Argentina with immigrants coming from Bolivia and Peru. We see the same thing in the Dominican Republic with migrants coming over from Haiti. And we certainly see it in a macro scale here in our own country. It is a consequence of the increasing globalization of our times. Today we have, thanks to the fall of the wall of Berlin, we have a new world situation, the new possibilities of globalization that have now allowed for the free movement of goods across borders, as we see in NAFTA and all that. And we certainly now have the free movement of capital and financial instruments. But at the present time, we still do not have the world catching up to the modern age with the free movement of people and the free movement of labor. Immigrants come here to the United States and they don't go to Haiti because this is where the jobs are. And that's the simple fact. And if they weren't here, if the immigrants weren't here, because our economy needs laborers in order to keep it moving and keep it functioning and growing, we would have to go look for them. And this is the reality. There's all sorts of debates about immigrants hurting the Americans in their quest for jobs, but the reality is certainly not that. Not when we have an economy that is as close to full employment as it could be. Even here in Central Florida, you can walk, you can ride around the streets, and you will find at restaurants and other places business signs hanging with signs hanging out the windows saying "Help Wanted." We need workers, and the workers have come, and because the society has not woken up to the way of making them come in a more rational and convenient way, namely setting up avenues for them to come legally, they've come anyway. They've come without legal papers. They've come without the documents. And sometimes people will raise the question, well, they're coming in such great numbers, can our American society integrate them? Well, basically, they've already been integrated, and they've integrated themselves. 20 years ago, immigrants were represented mostly, or were found mostly in 6 states of our country. 6 big states: New York, Florida, Texas, California, Illinois, and I forgot one. Today they are found in all 50 states. Even in little Vermont, there are Mexicans working in dairies, and the dairy farmers are very nervous about immigration or border patrol going through their farmlands, lest they frighten off the Mexicans and there's no one to milk the cows. Immigrants are everywhere, and they are working, and they're housed. They're not sleeping under bridges. They're not standing in bread lines. They are integrated. You know, it's one of the interesting things is that, you know, people have decided that this is a problem, and so now we're going to have we're going to have the government figure out a program to bring temporary workers and other people to those jobs when, and we know how inefficient the government is in doing those types of things, and the people have done it on their own, and they have done it relatively successfully with all the handicaps of not having the proper papers bring with them, and all the added handicaps given in recent years with the difficulties in securing driver's licenses, et cetera, et cetera. But they are here, and they are integrated as best as can be. Now, while it is better, much better to be legal than illegal in this country, one could probably make the case that, in a certain sense, illegals make the best kind of immigrants. And why do I say that? Because, these are people who have made a decision. They are in their country. It might be Mexico, it might be Haiti, Central America, Poland, even Canada, because that's one of the bigger representations of illegals in this country are Canadians. Is that right?
Glad to help out.
Yes. But the illegals, when they have decided to come here, they've made a decision. They don't like where they are, and they say, this is misery here. I'm not going to take this anymore. And so they take a risk. They make a decision and they take a risk. They cross the border, and they come without perhaps knowing the language, but they make a tremendous risk, saying that if I get on the other side and I work hard, if I work hard, I can make something of myself. I can be somebody. Now, American society, American capitalism, the American economy have traditionally rewarded people that are risk takers and people that are decision makers and people that are willing to work hard. The illegal immigrant comes here with no sense of entitlement. He comes with no sense of entitlement because there is no food stamps waiting for him. There is nobody waiting to help him do anything. He knows that if he's going to succeed, it will depend on him and him alone or her alone. And so in that sense, the illegals make the best kind of immigrants. Sometimes refugees are a little bit harder because, and we saw this in some refugee groups, because they came kind of beaten down and traumatized by whatever made them to be refugees, and they came into a program that had entitlements available for them, and sometimes it was harder for them to wean themselves off the assistance that the state was providing in order to stand up on their own and to make it on their own. So the illegals, as far as that goes, are great immigrants. Now, another thing is that we have to remember why the immigrants come here. Well, one of the things is that this is where the jobs are, as I said, but also the immigrants are coming because they certainly are dissatisfied with the status quo that has been handed to them. And many times in the effort to cross the border, to come here to seek a job, what the immigrants are doing is basically claiming for themselves the dignity of which is their birthright as human beings, as human persons. They are seeking conditions worthy of human life. And if they could not find those conditions worthy of human life in their native land, and their native lands have to bear responsibility for that, and certainly as in solidarity we have to help their native lands to provide conditions worthy of human life for their own people. But these people, having not found them in their native lands, come to seek those conditions worthy of human life here. And while not all immigrants are paloma blancas, white doves, however, it's safe to say that the majority of them, when they come here, are not coming because of some personal lark. They are not coming seeking some adventure, nor are they really seeking some self-fulfillment in the way that some of us feel that, they're looking for themselves. That's not the reason why they're coming here. They're coming basically to help their loved ones, to help their families, to help the people that they leave behind. That they leave behind not to abandon them. They leave them behind at great pain and sacrifice in order to help them. And you've heard speakers speak about the remittances that go back home. And one of the things if I can bring up Something from the Vatican Council, the fathers of the Vatican Council said that a human person can only realize himself as a human person. We can only become fully human only through the gift of ourselves, through the sincere gift of ourselves. That we could call the theology of the gift, which is really what human happiness is about, not in self-seeking but self-giving. Well, these migrants who have come here and send back millions, billions of dollars home in remittances are a living example of that theology of the gift. And because of that, I think the immigrants, legal and illegal, but the immigrants in general, they can also be a powerful force for the renewal of American culture, because they still believe in what is called the American dream. They still believe that by hard work and taking advantages of the opportunities that are offered them, they can become somebody in this country. And that, in other words, they have the values that American society has always honored, the values that have made America the country that it is. The immigrants have those values, and perhaps those values that the immigrants bring can serve as an antidote to the self-absorbed, it's all about me culture that has invaded too many of our bourgeoisie kids these days. Present company accepted, of course. But they can serve as a great example to us because of that theology of the gift. Now, you know, we talk about illegals, and a lot of people will say, well, I'm not against legal immigration, I'm against illegal immigration, and that's fine. And of course, but really, the illegals and the legals are mixed together. And because you find them in the same families. In the same families, you can have a father that's illegal and a mother illegal, or a child that's legal because of having been born here and the parents not legal. So demographically, there's no big difference between the legals and the illegals. And really, it's not the human person, it's not the person of the immigrant that's the problem. And I think this is very important for our society to remember. We can't demonize people. We can't make people into problems. Because the minute we consider a person or a class of persons as a problem, then we give ourselves permission to look for solutions. And the last century, the 20th century, taught us a terrible lesson about what happens when we do that, because then we give ourselves permission sometimes to apply final solutions, as happened with the Holocaust, when a whole class of people, a whole race of people were defined by other people as problems. The immigrants are not the problem. The illegal immigrants are not the problem. The problem is the broken system. The broken system that has to be updated and has to be made responsive to the new realities of the globalized world in which we live in, which means that we need a comprehensive immigration reform. And to do that, we have to address the situation of those 10 million or more people that are here without papers. We need to provide them with an avenue for a legal status in this country. You know, otherwise, what are we doing? To tolerate the continuation of a large group of illegals in this country, that because they're illegals, not because they want to be, but because there's no avenues for them to become legal, what we are doing is participating in the creation of a new underclass in this nation. An underclass that is existing because of the laws that are set up, or the way the laws are set up. And the last time we did this as a nation, the last time that we set up a underclass of people, we called it Jim Crow, when segregation was legalized. And this nation and the people affected by Jim Crow have not fully recovered, neither they or the nation as a whole. So we cannot tolerate 10 million, 12 million illegals. And we're not going to, I don't think we could tolerate trying any massive deportations that would break up families even more. So we have to find an avenue to legalize them. And at the same time, we need to fix the system so that families can be united and come together. The border wall is not the solution. It will only exacerbate the problem. In the past 10 years, the United States has spent over $1 billion on strengthening the wall or the fences between Mexico and the United States. And in those same 10 years, more illegal immigration has happened, not less. The wall has been completely ineffective. And what it has done is just created more human misery, because people that are coming over here seek more dangerous routes. And in the past 5 years, almost 3,000 people have died on the border. And most of those people who have died on the border have been women and children. And why? Because these women and children are only trying to reunite themselves with their fathers and husbands. Those fathers and husbands, as you heard in the last panel, they came here to work. They can't go back because of that border being more rigidly enforced, because of the bars to returning to the country. And since these guys did not take any vow of celibacy because they came to work here to pick tomatoes or to clean chickens, they want their wives next to them and they want their children next to them. And so a lot of illegal migration, a lot of trafficking, which is very exploited, is happening with women and children. They are the victims of this outdated and antiquated policy. The solution is not piecemeal. The solution is not borders. The solution is a comprehensive reform that will provide avenues for employers to have willing and able workers to come, that will provide avenues for those in this country already to become legalized, and that will allow, in a generous way, the reuniting of families, which has always been the hallmark of U.S. immigration policy, to bring families together and not to divide them unnecessarily. Thank you.
If there's so many people coming into Canada that have malicious intentions, then why would you allow more?
Well, I hope I conveyed that we have a tremendously powerful and effective lobby, immigration and refugee lobby of immigration lawyers, settlement officials or settlement people, NGOs, and so on. And in combination with the demographic shift that you already get from having had these huge numbers, these are tidal waves of people coming in, the vast majority, the overwhelming majority of whom are perfectly reasonable individuals. That's why I was a bit struck by the phrasing of the premise of the question. Then in that case, however, you develop a tremendous lobby and a surging support for more and more and more. And I indicated to you that we're now in a federal Liberal Party leadership race. And what we're now seeing is that at least one or two of the contenders are essentially trying to outbid the others for votes along this very line, without particular reference to any number of other priorities, including public safety and our ability to really set up conditions where we can live together in a genuinely pluralist and multiculturalist country such as Canada has successfully, I would suggest, become.
All day long we've been focusing, and rightfully so, on the role of the government in this issue. But in recent years there's been this emphasis on faith-based initiatives and so forth. Is there a role for the private sector in this immigration issue?
Well, of course, most of those illegals, if not all of those illegals, are employed by the private sector. And certainly, and this is why the Chambers of Commerce want a comprehensive immigration reform. And it's interesting that in this sense, politics does make strange bedfellows, because even the unions want comprehensive immigration reform, and both labor and capital are agreed on that. But the faith-based initiative is a very important thing. I was for 3 years chairman of the Migration Committee of the U.S. Bishops' Conference, and MRS, Migration and Refugee Services, which is an agency run by the United States bishops, have been involved since the time of World War II in resettling refugees to this country, and have done so very successfully in collaboration with the United States government, and also churches, Catholic churches and other churches have been very important sources of part of civil society in playing the role of helping the immigrants to acculturate and to integrate into American society, and certainly to continue to do so. I think that is a very important role for the churches and other elements of human society too, lest a too rapid assimilation takes place when the immigrant's children loses the values of the parents, and I think this is very important that we always encourage the immigrants' children, and as this Columbus Day celebration of the month of Hispanic heritage recalls very importantly, because it's important that we keep our roots, our ethnic and cultural roots, because ruthless people, ROOTLESS, ruthless people certainly can become very quickly ruthless people, RUTHLESS. And so it's very important that as we encourage immigrants to acculturate and to integrate, it should not be at the cost of their own identity in that, because we should see what, again, in a pluralistic and multicultural society, we should see the addition of these other cultural elements as an enrichment of the society as a whole, sort of like a tossed salad, so to speak. The more ingredients in the tossed salad, even with the new approved spinach, makes it even better tasting.
Can one attribute the growth of homegrown terrorists to the fear and control resultant from the fight against terrorism? I mean, citizens or immigrants rebelling against that system of control and fear from that fight against terrorism?
It's important to remember that the terrorists that started the war against the United States, that rammed those planes into the Pentagon, into the field in Pennsylvania, into the towers of New York, none of them were immigrants. They were all legal visitors. They all had tourist visas or student visas. None of them crossed the border illegally. And so I think, trying to stop terrorism with this billion-dollar wall on the southwest border is like trying to kill a fly with a sledgehammer. And the fly is dangerous, that's for sure, but we need a better and more accurate weapon to go after the fly, because when you you chase the fly with a sledgehammer, you end up bashing up the house.
Mr. Harris?
Well, the fact is that there have been a number of incidents of immigrants, people new to the United States, who've been involved in terrorism, and that since 9/11. That's not terribly widely publicized, but of course there was you remember the shooting in LA International Airport. That's close to my heart because among some of the work the multi-ethnic, multi-religious and non-religious organization, the Canadian Coalition for Democracies, does work with are people who are victims of terrorism. And there was a Canadian, an immigrant to Canada actually, who was at LA International Airport. Her life has been ruined. She's been financially ruined, disabled for life. And so she's one of the many victims of the wrong side of this kind of exercise. The vast majority, of course, as I say, of immigrants, newcomers, however defined, are, to say the least, benign and extremely well-meaning people and so on. But I think we have to be rather careful, and I was a bit concerned about any intimation that we should take too seriously the idea that in some way we might bring upon ourselves the terrorism from which we suffer. This has been fashionable in some realms, but the simple fact is that if you look at the doctrines of those people who are committing some of these crimes and offenses, they can be traced back generations and in some respects well before the creation of the United States of America, let alone Canada.
Yeah, but we remember too one of the people arrested in Afghanistan as a terrorist was an Anglo young man that was born in California and somehow went wrong, and
that was radical extremism of the Islamic variety.
Yes, but it didn't have anything to do with his
race
immigration.
Is not particularly relevant,
nor immigration status.